Modern theists address this moral fluidity by saying that our ancestors lived in a different time. But think of what this entails. Theists insist that there are universal, objective moral laws. But what good are these laws if they are subject to time and socio-economic circumstances? Are we really to believe that an all-loving God could and would say yesterday that women are second-class citizens, but today that they're equal? Nonsense. No omnibenevolent entity could pivot like this. And here's the thing. We could do the same breakdown with slavery and homosexual condemnation. Just last week, you saw it in the news, Pope Francis received an update patch from God, granting priest players the new class ability to buff same-sex couples. Yeah, what we're witnessing right now, right before us, we're seeing it with our own eyes, is supposed objective moral values of theism being relative, changing to the circumstances as it has for the particularly last 300 years. But what do religions do about this? How do they deal with this history? It's genius. They spend great resources, often tax-free, to decorate the likes of Paul Copan to obfuscate these truths. Once the pious are dragged kicking and screaming into modernity, they have the audacity to claim that our moral progress is theirs. But it's worse. They say that if it wasn't for Judeo-Christian values, then we wouldn't be speaking here about these things at all. But the briefest look at history and what the Church Fathers actually believed and how they backed up their unfashionable views by today's standard with solid scripture demonstrates just how unreasonable modern religion is, or it is to believe in God today. Apologetics is, by my lights, a lie we tell ourselves, a soothing fiction that we adopt, sacrificing our integrity to reassure us of our fears. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the conversation that comes.
Stephen Woodford and Paul Copan recently got together to debate the question, is belief in God reasonable? And as a part of that conversation, they got into a debate around morality. What is morality? Is it objective? Where does it come from? Is it best explained by God or by something else? It's a really, really good back and forth conversation that I think holds a lot of value in the sense that it helps me at least understand the perspective that Stephen has as an atheist. And then you can see the way that that lines up against the view that Paul Copan holds as a Christian. And I think through this conversation, it's also interesting because you can see the way that some of the things that are said are actually misinterpreted, or the way that things kind of get lost in translation, and we can sometimes talk over each other rather than really listening to what the other side is saying. So I'm going to go ahead and stop talking now, and then I'm going to give you guys some of my thoughts on the back end. Let's do it.
I'm going to hand back to Paul, because you've had a bit of time now to think about some of the examples that has led Stephen into naturalism, for you to then comment on those general clues.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for your very punchy, or your punches delivered at on a number of points here. I appreciate that. Let me just say a few things. I didn't see a whole lot of things in terms of the actual metaphysical context being refuted in terms of the issue of evil and suffering, consciousness, rationality, and so forth. What is evil on naturalism? Evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. That's how we typically understand it. But for naturalism, there is no way things ought to be. So a lot of the moral language that is being used is simply the result of how, say, humans have developed. But humans could have developed a different morality on naturalism. So I pointed over and over again how naturalists are stumped by how these sorts of things like consciousness and so forth could have emerged, because there is no kind of resource within naturalism to actually give rise to these sorts of things. Now, I could say, Martin Luther and so forth. Yeah, I mean, people say things that are, crazy, and we, there are things that we can, there are certain developments in history, and we recognize and adjust to them. We don't have all the information, but we can still benefit from mistakes of the past. Okay, well, what about things like Genesis? The female is made as a help or a helper to the man. Well, that's actually a misrepresentation. God himself is called the help of Israel, the same word that is used there. And we can talk about Genesis 1:1. All human beings, male and female, made in the image of God, made with this, made with dignity and worth. That we can talk about. Well, what about the New Testament, where we you can see Exodus 20, honor your father and your mother. that there is to be this kind of responsibility toward both, not just, say, the husband or the father.
Okay, well, let's press into morality then for our last couple of questions. Just to be clear, Paul, you're not arguing that atheists and naturalists can't be moral.
Nope, of course not.
What is the point that you're making?
I'm just saying if they are adhering to an objective morality, this is something that is alien to the foundations of naturalism, which begins with matter, energy, space, and time. So it's a jump. I think it's a borrowing from a viewpoint like theism, but it doesn't have the resources within itself to actually bring us to that. But of course, I think because people are, atheists are made in the image of God like theists are, and so they will recognize a lot of the same sorts of moral values. So yeah, I understand that. So from an epistemological point of view, that we can know right from wrong, sure, I'd grant you that. But I'd say the atheist is not, or the naturalist is not going deep enough by saying, well, what actually gives to us dignity and worth, something like the image of God does. But I don't see where you get intrinsic dignity based on an atheist or naturalistic point of view.
So you're saying the strongest meta-ethical foundation for human value and worth comes from theism, and we heard a very different point from you in your talk, Stephen.
We did indeed. It mesmerizes me that Christianity had dominion for nearly 2,000 years, or at least a good 1,000 years, if you take it from the end of the Romans with their polytheism. And what we saw was slavery being kept, women being subordinated to second-class status, homosexuals being thrown off roofs and hanged, and then the Enlightenment happened, where atheists raised up, and people that said, no, we've had enough of this. And there was plenty of Christians involved in this as well, saying, no, this is not how it's done. And now, with the advancements that we have the audacity to claim that this is Judeo-Christian advancement. It's not. It's in direct opposition to Christianity. This is why Christianity doesn't look like Islam today. It's because we had the Enlightenment. It's because the Enlightenment won. Now, when it comes to grounding morality, I don't think that theism has that answered at all. So, you've got this thing known as the Euthyphro dilemma, which I'm sure many of you have heard of before, and it says, is something good because God commands it? If it's good because God commanded it, well, we're not really talking about morality, are we? We're simply talking about might makes right. Follow the divine dictator. But if God commands it because it is right, then goodness exists outside of God. And thus, it's open to atheists. It could be a Platonic form, for instance. It could be non-materialistic. I'm open to this, right? So you have this situation going on here. So I don't think that when it comes to the hard grounding of morality that our intuitions cry out for, theism or atheism can give you the answer. I think really it's going to be cashed out in terms of evolution, playing into our intuitions.
So a final question for you. Where does the motivation then come from? If you do dismiss ultimate meanings and purposes such as God, where does the motivation come from then to live a particular moral life?
Lots of ways that you could go around this, but if I just do it from a personal angle, it would be this. I'll give you an example. I don't eat meat. Why don't I eat meat? I can't eat meat, everyone eats meat, it's a normal part of society. It's because I lose sleep. I lay there at night and I go, damn, that was a sentient being. And for me, personally, that causes me enough disruption, enough reflection that I just decide I don't want to do it. Why is it that I'm nice to people? It's a similar thing. It's because I feel bad if I act in certain ways. That's good enough to be my motivating factor. It's what motivates me to act in moral ways. Fortunately, we've made more discoveries and we've figured out what's really going on. What is at the background, and you are going to get etched into evolution by natural selection, and it's going to have some very uncomfortable truths. But one of the things we have learned from finding out about the 200 billion galaxies, the 400 billion stars in our one galaxy, so many facts that we've learned about in the last 2 centuries is that much of the world is not in tune with our intuitions, and it will violate what we want it to be. I think you need to be courageous to just accept that, okay, some of the things we want are not that way. You have to navigate that space through different means.
And Paul, final responses?
Yeah, let me touch on the Euthyphro argument. It's not a dilemma, it's an argument. There are 3 options rather than 2. And there's often a confusion with those who use the Euthyphro argument because they confuse what is good with what is right. Goodness has to do with value. And value includes things like deeds that go beyond the call of duty, like deeds of supererogation, like donating your kidney to a stranger. That's a good thing, but it's not as though you're morally obligated to do that. So deeds of supererogation, beauty would be another source, would be another category of value. We could also talk about rationality as being something that is of value, called axiology, and also something within there is, we could also add duties. Duties are a broader part of goodness, but they are not goodness itself. So to equate God's commands with goodness is a fallacy. It's a mistake. And a lot of contemporary divine command theorists like Philip Quinn, Robert Adams, Stephen Evans, they're saying it's not as though morality is arbitrary, that just God says this is right and this is wrong. Even in the scriptures, there are things that God says he could not command because they're intrinsically evil. So there is a good and just God who is not going to command some things. There may be some difficult things that are commanded, but God is not going to command something that is intrinsically evil. And the point is that those commands are our duties. But there is a good character behind that, and so to say that goodness is simply arbitrary misses the point that goodness is rooted in the very character of God. And so so we can say, well, what about on a naturalistic viewpoint? Well, what is the standard of goodness? Where does that come from? It seems like you're appealing to something beyond nature in order to appeal to that. And what makes that standard good? Is there some standard beyond that will actually confirm that? You think of a meter bar, the metric bar that had been kind of the standard for the meter. Well, that was actually what set the standard for what the meter was, and there was no need to go beyond it and say, well, what's beyond that meter? That was the standard, and that was sufficient. In the same way, God's character is a sufficient stopping point. And we can also add that if there is this sort of a moral standard that exists, how is it that human beings who have kind of just evolved this kind of the eternal standard that has existed, well, how is it that human beings have evolved to the point where those things that they affirm as their duties actually correspond to those, say, eternal moral facts that have been anticipating them? This sounds like a great cosmic coincidence. It's a lot simpler to say that there is a God who is the source of goodness, who issues commands, who also makes human beings in God's image, so that there is a much simpler, organic, unifying explanation than saying that there is this standard out there, this transcendent standard, and that human beings have kind of evolved to recognize that as being what is the go-to mark for how they ought to behave, for example. So I think the Euthyphro dilemma is not a dilemma at all. There's a third option here, that God is the source of goodness, and that those commands that are distinct from value or goodness are actually issued from that character that is good and just.
I know you want to respond.
I really do, yeah.
I also wanted to ask other questions around evil and suffering, but we are coming to the end of our time. It's interesting, we've looked at cosmology, physics, biology, morality, and we've two different worldviews sitting here. Where do you want to take the question? So I'm going to hand over to Sam, and let's see what you want to ask our speakers.
Okay, so now in the video, they pivot into a time of Q&A with the audience. I want to break down a few points that are made during this particular interaction that they have around morality, because I think that this back and forth is such a good depiction of the way that we, as I think believers and atheists, can sometimes speak over each other or speak at cross purposes and not really hear what's being said. So Stephen begins his argument by pointing to history and saying, hey, look at this period of time where Christians had dominion and a lot of bad things happened. But that's not an argument in any way against God as a source for moral values and duties, which is the topic at hand. That's just an example of, if anything, the fact that people, including Christians, have fallen short of that moral standard. In fact, Stephen's accusation itself implies an objective moral standard that he's measuring Christians throughout history against. So in this way, his argument is actually self-refuting, because he is using the very thing that Paul Copan is saying is best explained by God. Now, when it comes to this, I have to point to C.S. Lewis, who said it most poetically when he said that he looked out at the evil in the universe, at the evil on this planet, and he said that there cannot be a good God in the face of this evil. But then he thought about that longer and he said, wait a second, what am I measuring everything that I'm calling evil against? How do I have the ability to perceive that something is crooked unless I have a sense of what is straight? Where does that compass come from? In Stephen's view, that moral compass that he himself uses, that he says, I feel bad if I act in certain ways. That's a quote from Stephen in this debate. And that sense of conscience or moral compass is itself something that is a true riddle on materialism. If the argument is an argument of materialism versus something transcendent above matter, the conversation's already over before it's begun, because a conversation about morality is a conversation about something immaterial, is the first point. The second point is that Stephen's moral compass itself, from a Christian perspective, is a gift from God that he's using to judge Christian history by. He's using the apparatus that he has that is best explained by God to make a judgment about Christians falling short of God's moral standards. It seems that the only alternative to this, based on at least Stephen's line of reasoning, is that goodness is its own end, that goodness is this thing that exists somehow in the abstract sense or in the Platonic sense. It's this immaterial thing that is there, that is its own stopping point. And all that Christians are saying is that let's go one step farther. And it's funny because this is the same thing when it comes to other abstract truths like the universal constants or mathematics themselves. We're just saying, yes, we can see that those things are immaterial. So we all agree on that. We can see that they're not part of nature, that they're that truth itself, that rationality itself, that consciousness itself, thinking itself, these things are all outside of a material world, but they all have embedded within them a question of, if then they're not material, where do they come from and what are they for and how do they all work and fit together well? So in summary, the sort of straw man version of what Christians mean when we talk about objective morality is, because it's in the Bible, therefore we're going to do it. But if it wasn't in the Bible, then we would just do whatever the heck we want. And that is a complete straw man fallacy. What we're really saying, and let me go on the record and say this, is that there is a shared, collective, universal sensibility that humanity has been given from above by God that permeates across time and across culture. Morality points to a moral law giver. This is the God that we're talking about within Christianity, not just a God who has placed certain rules and regulations within the text of the Bible, but a God who has baked moral sensibilities into the core of every human heart as a part of us being made in his image. And the deep, beautiful truth within Christianity is that everyone who exists, everyone watching this video, that you exist because you're wanted, that you are for a purpose, that there's joy that God has designed for you to have in knowing him, that the creature best flourishes in the union with the creator. If you guys are interested in this type of content, I'm going to put another video here that you can check out. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.